Today we're going to be showing you how to do a CO2 recovery on your green feed system. Initially, we're going to need a few different things, and this is going to be how the device comes in your unit, and I'll show you how to assemble it. But we're also going to need the scale, which if you purchase the gas program, it's going to include the scale. For every CO2 recovery that you perform, you're going to need a separate CO2 tank, and these are just 90-gram CO2 tanks. You'll also want something to record your weights with. We have a template available on our website that you can download, but you can just as easily write down the masses on just a sheet of paper. You'll also need a 1 kilogram calibration weight, which will be supplied for you, and that's just to verify that the scale is working correctly. You'll require the CO2 recovery device, which we'll assemble soon, and then also your tablet so that you can control green feed and also view the progress of the CO2 release. All right, we're going to show you how to assemble the CO2 release device, and you'll only need to perform this the very first time you get the device because we don't send it to you fully assembled for shipping purposes. It comes in basically two parts. You'll have the antenna here that holds the RFID antenna, or the RFID reader, and then you also have the actual release nozzle. And basically we're just going to combine these both together. We're going to place the release device right over here, and you can basically position it anywhere here. It probably won't have a very level setting. Just put it there and get as close to straight up as you can. We're going to want the label facing up, pointed toward this RFID tag. And we're also going to want the F right here facing the same way that the nozzle is facing. All right, so I'm going to do that right here. And we'll just use the pipe clamp, which should also be included in the shipment, and we'll loop it around here and get it started. And here's where you're going to need a screwdriver just to assemble the thing. And I'm probably going to screw this up several times. Once you get it started, you'll be able to realign it in the correct position, and then just turn it until it's tight. All right, as I mentioned, it's not going to be perfectly straight up and down, and that's just because of the hexagonal shape of the release device right here. But as long as we have this end facing up legible and in line with the RFID tag on top, this is how we want it facing. And then the F for front is going to be pointing the same way as the nozzle. And we just want to make sure that this is tight and won't rotate very easily. All right, the next step, we supply several of these. These are just adapters, and they include an O-ring, which probably over time will degrade. And that's why we supply multiple adapters here. This just screws right onto the very end of the release device. And we want to screw it on until it's tight. You know, don't get a wrench or anything, but we just want to make sure it's hand tight and won't turn anymore. So we have that release device fully assembled and ready to go. All right, now we're going to show you the checklist of things that you need to make sure are correct before we start a CO2 release. The first thing, you want to make sure that no animals have been around or using the system for at least 5 minutes before you do a release. And you want to continue this the entire duration of the CO2 recovery. So the recovery usually will take about 15 to 20 minutes, so that entire duration you don't want animals or people near the system breathing into it because we release CO2. The next thing, we want to make sure that we have a clean air filter. So if we come around back here and check our air filter, I would advise, even if you think it is clean, still clean it, replace it with a new one before you do a CO2 recovery device or release. All right, the next thing, we want to make sure that our fan is on, which right now it's not. And we also want to make sure our pump is going, which right now it's not. And we can tell because on the new systems, we have our flow gauge right here, and you can see that both, the gauge is at 0 right now. I'm going to turn on the pump using the Control Feed app. So we want to make sure that our pump is pumping. And then we also want to make sure our fan is on, which I'll turn it on right now. And now that the fan is on, we want to make sure it stays on for 5 minutes before continuing the CO2 release. All right, now we're going to first have to level our scale. If you purchased our gas program, your purchase will come with a scale. We want to make sure that it's on a level surface. Very solid and won't, wiggle around if a slight bit of wind blows on it. If you come back and look at the very back here, you'll notice that we have a leveling bubble right here, and we want to adjust the feet on the scale to make sure that it doesn't wobble and the bubble is in the very center, so we make sure that it's level and sturdy. Once you have it set up, if your scale does not read 0.00 grams, press the tare button, and that will make sure that it reads 0. And now we're going to use our 1 kilogram mass, calibration mass. If you don't have this 1 kilogram calibration mass, then you can use any small 1 to 2 kilogram weight, but we want to make sure that it's reading reliably. So make sure that every time you weigh this, it gives you the exact same number every time. So we're going to tare our scale and weigh our calibration mass. And now on our sheet of paper, we're reading that it's 1,000.52 grams. So on our recovery sheet, we're going to write down what our calibration mass was, 0.52. And every time we weigh our release device, we want to make sure that we weigh our calibration mass before that, and that'll make sure that if our scale is not reading correctly, we'll be able to catch that very easily. All right, so our fan has been running for at least 5 minutes. Our pump has been on. No animals have been near the system for at least 5 minutes. It's about time for our first release, but first I'm going to show you how to attach the CO2 cartridge onto the CO2 release device. Now keep in mind that this is compressed gas. It can be dangerous and it can be very cold because it's CO2. So put it on the adapter and start turning. And once you get it locked into place where it stays by itself, hold the thing upright. You don't want to have it upside down when you're installing this. Also, you'll see these vent holes on the adapter. You want to keep your hands away from there and don't turn right here. You want to keep your hand down here when you're turning. So I'm going to turn until I feel a slight bit of resistance, and then I'm just going to keep on turning. You'll hear a swoosh, and I'm just going to keep turning until it's hand tight. All right, so now that it's installed, I'm going to give it a test release just to make sure that we're releasing gas. So when I turn this 90 degrees, I'm going to turn it back and make sure that we hear it spray gas. So here we go. And you can hear it slightly die down as I turn it back off. All right, so we're ready to weigh our CO2 device. I'll look at my calibration mass, and we're still reading pretty close to what we recorded. And really, if we're within 1/10 of a gram of our calibration weight, that should be okay. So I'm going to remove this, and we're going to weigh our CO2 device. And you can see I put it so that the platform is facing down, so it's nice and level. Pretty easy to keep solid on the scale. Now we'll write down our weight of 1303, and we'll go 0.4. All right, now again, I can't stress how important it is to make sure that no people or animals breathe near the system. So if you have to gate off the entire area at least 2 meters, if you can go more, that's even better. But don't breathe when you're near the system. So I'm going to hold my breath the entire time when I'm near the system. Now if you look And we'll show a close-up of this. That hole is where I'm going to insert this release nozzle. Once I insert it, I'm going to wait for the chime to sound, indicating that it detected the RFID tag. I'm going to turn the nozzle on and then step away from it. What we want to do is release for about 3 minutes. If you have the control feed app open, we can press on this CO2 Recovery button, and we can actually see the CO2 being released into the system right here. It's also going to keep track of how much time we have left on a release. So we have 130 seconds left on the release. But we may go longer depending on for subsequent releases, depending on how much we're releasing during this first one. So we're going to pause the time for about 2 minutes here, and then we'll come back and remove the release device. All right, we're just about at the end of our release. In fact, we just got the end of the release, and so now our next step is waiting. I'm going to go grab that CO2 release device out of there. So first, before I even approach it, I'm going to hold my breath and keep it held the entire time. All right, so what I did that very last step, I turned off the valve, but it still was releasing just whatever leftover pressure was in the system. So I waited for that pressure to release, and you can actually hear it. If you couldn't hear it in the video, you can hear it slowly decay, just like we did when we did the test release. So I waited about 10 seconds, 5 to 10 seconds for it to completely stop releasing and then pull it out. All right, so now we're gonna weigh this again, but first we wanna make sure our scale's working. I'm gonna tare it again. And now I'll take my calibration weight, and we should be reading the exact same number, 1000.53, so we're okay. And now one thing I do wanna mention, because of adiabatic cooling, since we're releasing compressed gas into a gas, this is gonna get very cold. And it's almost ice cold to the touch. So in the event that you do have very cold environments, you might notice frost or just condensation form all over the tank and the release device. So we want to make sure not to weigh that condensation or ice. So if you do have ice forming on here, make sure to wipe it down, make sure there's no ice or condensation on it when you weigh the system. So now we're seeing 1276. .3. Now what we're waiting for now is during a CO2 release, during a CO2 recovery, you want to make sure that you have 3 minutes between each release. And so the control feed app is actually taking that into account. So we have 50 seconds before we're going to do our next release. So during that time, like I said, this is still almost ice cold. We want to warm this up as much as possible because of adiabatic cooling, it's going to release a lot slower this next time. And so just some rough calculations, we released about 27 grams here. And we want to shoot for 30 grams for every release. Now you'll probably learn as you do more and more releases that it does diminish quite quickly. And so I'm going to actually release longer this release. So instead of going for 3 minutes, I might go 3.5, maybe even 4 minutes for this next release, just because it's much colder. So I'm waiting for the time to finish. Now we're ready for the next release, and I've warmed it up quite a bit. It's still cold, but I've warmed it up a bit. Again, we want to make sure there's no condensation or frost formed on it. We're going to zero our scale. We're going to use our calibration weight to make sure that it's reading 1000.5 grams. And then we're going to weigh our release device again. And it should be fairly close to what we measured on our final mass before. So now it's drifted a little bit, but not anything significant. 6.3. All right, so now the exact same thing as before. I'm gonna hold my breath this entire time. I'm gonna insert it, wait for the chime to go off. Once it's inserted and set in place, I'll turn the knob and walk away. If you look at our recovery sheet here, you'll notice that we have a start time and end time. Greenfeed actually takes care of keeping track of when we start our release and finish them. But if you do want to record, roughly about the time that you start a release, that might help just in case you perform a recovery and don't record it immediately. So I am going to write roughly the time that I did this release. 15, 20. But since Greenfeed keeps track of that, we don't actually have to record that. We just heard our chime sound, and like I said, because it's going to be releasing quite a bit slower, we're going to wait about 30 seconds, maybe a minute longer. And depending on how much this release actually released in weight, that'll determine how much our next release is. So I'm waiting about 30 more seconds, and actually our time is about up. So I'm going to hold my breath, and I'm going to grab it just like we did before. And I'm going to tear the scale again and put on our calibration mass, and it's reading the same number, so we're good to weigh again. As before, it's still cold, but there's no frost or condensation that's formed on it, so I can go ahead and weigh this. All right, the 3 minutes is up, and the system is ready for another CO2 release. So first we need to weigh our system and make sure there's no condensation or ice that's formed on it. And it's still cold, but we'll just go a little bit longer to compensate for that. First we're gonna make sure that our scale is reading 0, put our calibration weight on it, and we're still reading the same number. I'm gonna write that number down. Now we're going to weigh our CO2 release device. And we're reading roughly the same as before. It's a tiny bit less. All right, now rinse and repeat. We're going to do the exact same thing. So while we're releasing, you can see that the difference here from the first release was 27.1 grams. And our second release, even though we released for longer, is actually just a little bit less release. And so this final one, since it's probably even colder than it was before, we're gonna release for about 30 seconds longer than we did before. So we'll go for about 4.5 minutes for this release. Our chime just sounded about 30 seconds ago, and so we're gonna wait just a little bit longer here and then we'll pull it out. So by the time I hold my breath and go over there, that'll be about time. And I do see some frost starting to form on the bottom here, so I'll just wipe that clean and make sure there's no condensation or frost forming on any of it. We're gonna tear our scale one more time. and then weigh our calibration weight. And we're getting the same number, so that's good. So now the final weight here, 1225.63. All right, so now that we've performed 3 CO2 recovery releases, we're just about finished. I do want to point out that since these are 90-gram cylinders, there's roughly 90 grams of CO2 in here. And if you look at our masses that we've released roughly 70 to 80 grams of CO2. So that means that there's somewhere in the 10 gram of CO2 left in here, which if you release that quickly, it's going to turn into dry ice, which is very cold and can be painful if it gets on you. So just like I was careful when I installed the cartridge, I'm going to be just as careful when I'm removing it. So what I usually like to do is actually start releasing the gas, not anywhere near the system, but just start releasing it. And then I'm going to keep my hands far away from this area right here, because that's where all the gas is going to vent out of. So I'm going to keep it upright and just turn to open it. All right, so in fact you can see some dry ice form right there. So this is just an empty cartridge. You can recycle this and dispose of it as you want. We're going to keep this CO2 release device assembled for next month when we perform the CO2 recovery on the same green feed. Or if you have multiple green feeds, you can perform them all subsequently. Okay, the final thing that we need to do is make sure that the fan and the pump stay on for at least 5 minutes after our final release. And we also don't want any animals near the system during that time. So it's actually been quite a bit longer than that since our final release. And so now if you're operating on a pasture trailer or a solar system where conserving battery is important, you can turn the fan off. So I'm just going to do that in my control feed app. After 5 minutes, you can open up the feeder and let animals resume using it.